pack your things and get out. I'm not running a shelter for people who refuse to grow up." My father said that on a Tuesday evening in October, while the hockey game played quietly in the background, and my mother stood at the kitchen sink pretending to wash a mug she'd already washed twice. I was 31 years old. I had a single carry-on bag packed before he finished the sentence, not because I'd planned for this moment, because I'd been half expecting it for years. "My name is Serena Kowalski, and the night my father told me I was a disappointment was the same night I realized I had stopped needing his opinions somewhere along the way without even noticing. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand what happened, you need to understand my family. We grew up in Mississauga, Ontario, a solid, practical household where my father worked 32 years as a civil engineer for the city and my mother taught elementary school until her knees gave out. They were good people in the way that people can be good and still cause damage. They worked hard. They sacrificed. They had opinions about what a life well lived looked like, and those opinions did not leave much room for interpretation. My older brother, Thomas, was their benchmark. Thomas had done everything correctly. University of Toronto, engineering degree, then a master's. A stable government position with a pension. He owned a semi-detached in Oakville, drove a sensible car, and called every Sunday. At every family dinner, his name came up the way weather comes up. Casually, predictably, and always as a reference point for something else. I was the something else. I had dropped out of the University of Guelph in my second year, not because I was failing, not because I was struggling. I left because I had started a small business on the side, a boutique social media consultancy helping local businesses in Guelph build their online presence. And it had quietly started making more money than my part-time job at the campus bookstore. At 20 years old, I looked at the math and made a decision. I did not tell my parents the real reason I left. I tried once, early on, when I was still figuring out whether the business was real or just lucky. My father had looked at me across the dinner table and said, "Social media, that's not a career, Serena. That's what people do when they're bored." My mother had nodded slowly, so I stopped explaining. For years, I kept the business quiet. My parents assumed I was doing some kind of freelance work, piecing together odd jobs, drifting. They never asked for details. I think they preferred not knowing, because not knowing let them maintain a particular story about me, one that fit neatly into the narrative they'd already written. Meanwhile, the business grew. What had started as helping a few restaurants and boutiques manage their Instagram accounts had evolved into something I genuinely hadn't anticipated. By the time I was 26, I had a team of 4. By 28, we had clients across the country, brands in Vancouver, Calgary, Montreal. By 30, the company employed 19 people, operated out of a proper office in downtown Toronto, and had been featured twice in Canadian Business Magazine. I didn't tell my parents any of this, not out of spite, more out of exhaustion. Every time I'd tried to bring up the business over the years, my father would redirect to Thomas. How Thomas had real security, how Thomas knew what he wanted and went after it the right way. After enough redirections, I simply stopped trying. I came back to Mississauga in early October because my parents' basement had flooded and my father had asked for help coordinating the contractors while my mother recovered from a minor knee surgery. I thought I'd stay 2, maybe 3 weeks. Help out, make sure things were sorted, then go back to Toronto. What I hadn't anticipated was that living under that roof again, even temporarily, would compress all the old dynamics back into place like we'd never moved past them. It started small. Comments at dinner. My father asking whether I was getting enough hours. My mother suggesting, gently, that maybe I should think about something more stable. Had I considered going back to school? Maybe something in accounting. They were always hiring in accounting. I smiled and changed the subject. I was 31 years old. I was not going to argue about accounting. Then came the Sunday when Thomas brought his family over for dinner. Everything felt normal at first. My sister-in-law brought dessert. My niece and nephew ran around the backyard. My mother had made her chicken cacciatore, which always meant she was in a good mood. I sat across from Thomas and thought, maybe this is fine, maybe we can just have a nice evening. Then my uncle arrived unexpectedly. My father's younger brother, visiting from Sudbury. He's the kind of man who fills a room with noise and means no harm by any of it. He sat down, looked at me and said, "So, Serena, what are you up to these days? Still doing your little internet thing?" Before I could answer, my father laughed. "We're still trying to figure that out ourselves." The table chuckled. Thomas looked at his plate. I said, "It's going well, actually." And I smiled, because I was not going to do this. Not tonight. But my father wasn't finished. He leaned back and said, in the voice he used when he wanted to sound like he was offering wisdom, "The thing is, some people take the long road, and some people take the right road. Thomas put in the work. He's got something to show for it." He nodded toward my brother, like Thomas was a before and after photo. Thomas shifted in his chair. Even he looked uncomfortable. I stayed quiet. Quiet had always been my strategy with my father. Don't engage. Let it pass. Go back to Toronto tomorrow. None of it matters. But then he said something he couldn't take back. "Honestly? I look at you, and I see someone who had every opportunity and just didn't." He shook his head. "You dropped out of school. You've been scraping together freelance work for a decade, and you still don't have a single thing to show for it. At your age, Thomas had a career. You don't even have a plan." The table went very quiet. My uncle looked at the ceiling. My sister-in-law suddenly needed to check on the kids. My mother was staring at her water glass. I looked at my father for a long moment. I thought about saying something. I thought about pulling out my phone and showing him the Canadian business article. I thought about explaining, calmly, that I employed 19 people and had just signed a contract worth more than his annual salary. Instead, I said, "Okay." I stood up from the table, walked upstairs, pulled my carry-on from under the guest bed, and packed it in 11 minutes. When I came downstairs, my father was still in his chair. My mother had moved to the living room and was pretending to read. "I think it's better if I go," I said. My father didn't argue. My mother didn't look up. I walked out to my car, the black Audi A5. They'd always assumed I was leasing on credit. And I drove back to Toronto in the dark without calling anyone. I want to be honest about the weeks that followed, because this is the part of the story that usually gets cleaned up in the telling. I was not fine right away. I drove home and sat in my parking garage for a while, before I could make myself go upstairs. Not crying. I was past crying about my father by that point, but hollowed out in a specific way that I recognized. The kind of tired that has nothing to do with sleep. I called my best friend Camille and told her what had happened. She said, "Serena, you have been protecting him from the truth of who you are for 10 years. At some point, that becomes your problem too." I didn't say anything back because she was right. I went back to work. The next 5 weeks were actually some of the most productive of my career. I had a major pitch for a national retail chain that I'd been preparing for months, a team expansion to plan, and a possible partnership conversation happening with a PR firm in Vancouver. I buried myself in it, not to escape, or maybe a little to escape, but mostly because the work was the one place where I had always known exactly what I was doing. My parents did not call. I did not call them either. 5 weeks of silence, which was almost impressive, given that my mother typically checked in at least once a week. The thing that broke the silence was not me. It was my father's retirement celebration. He had officially retired from his position with the city at the end of November, and the retirement committee at his old department had organized a luncheon in his honor at a hotel in downtown Toronto. My uncle had coordinated it, reaching out to various people my father had worked with over the years. One of those people, as it turned out, was a former city contractor who had since moved into the private sector. That contractor's company was one of my clients. The luncheon was held on a Friday afternoon at a hotel ballroom on Front Street. I didn't know about it until my assistant mentioned the Thursday before that she'd received a formal RSVP notice from a guest coordinator, a name I recognized as my uncle's email address. asking to confirm our company's table for the retirement luncheon. I sat with that information for a moment. Our company's table. My uncle had apparently reached out to the contractor client about the event. The client had purchased a sponsor table on behalf of our company as a goodwill gesture. And nobody, not my uncle, not the client, not the event coordinator, had connected the dots that the company name on that table was mine. I thought about backing out. I genuinely considered it for about 20 minutes. But then I thought about what Camille had said. I had been protecting my father from the truth of who I was for 10 years. I confirmed the table. On Friday, I arrived at the hotel early. I wore a charcoal blazer, dark trousers, boots. Nothing showy. Just how I normally dressed for client events. Our company's table was positioned near the front of the room. I sat down, greeted our client, made small talk, checked my phone. When my parents arrived, I saw my father first. He was wearing his good navy suit. The one he wore to Thomas's convocation. I'd always remembered it. And he was shaking hands with someone near the door. My mother was beside him in a deep burgundy dress. They looked happy in the particular way people look when an event is in their honor. My uncle spotted me first. I watched the expression move across his face in stages. Recognition, confusion, recalculation. He walked over and said, quietly, "Serena, what are you?" And then he looked at the table placard and stopped speaking entirely. The placard read, Walke Consulting Group, Lead Digital Partner. My uncle stood there for a moment, then said, "Your father doesn't know." "I know," I said. "Are you going to tell him before?" "He'll figure it out." It happened during the opening remarks. The event coordinator welcomed guests, thanked the sponsors, and read out the table partners. When she said, "And we want to thank the Walke Consulting Group, our lead digital partner, represented here today by their founder and CEO." She looked at the table, found me, and finished, "Serena Kowalski." The room applauded. I stood briefly, smiled, sat back down. From across the room, I watched my parents. My mother had gone completely still. My father had turned in his seat to find our table, and when his eyes landed on me, sitting at the sponsor table in the front of the room with Walke Consulting Group printed in front of me, he looked like a man who had just opened a door expecting a closet and found a staircase. The luncheon continued. There were speeches, a slideshow of my father's career milestones, a framed commendation from the department. I sat through it all. I ate the salmon. I spoke with our client about an upcoming campaign. I was professional and present and completely calm in a way that I hadn't entirely expected of myself. When the formal program ended and the room shifted to casual mingling, I felt someone approaching the table from my left. I looked up. My father was standing there with my mother just behind him. He looked older than he had at dinner 5 weeks ago. Or maybe I was just seeing him differently. He said my name. I said, "Hi." He looked at the table. He looked at me. He said, "You work for this company?" "I founded it," I said, 10 years ago. We have offices here in Toronto, 19 employees. We work with clients across the country. Neither of them said anything for a moment. My mother sat down slowly in the empty chair beside me. She didn't seem to do it on purpose. It was more like her legs just made that decision. "How long?" she said, and then she stopped. "Since I was 21, I said. "When I left Guelph." My father remained standing. The noise of the room seemed very far away. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" he said. And here's where I had to be careful, because I had rehearsed anger for this conversation for a long time. I had run through versions of it on long drives, and in the shower, and at 2 in the morning when I couldn't sleep. The versions where I said everything I'd held back, where I listed every dismissive comment, every redirect to Thomas, every dinner where I'd tried to start a sentence and been talked over. But standing, or sitting, rather, in that hotel ballroom, I found I didn't want the rehearsed version. I wanted the true one. "I tried," I said. "A few times. When I was starting out, I tried to tell you what I was building. You said it wasn't a real career. So I stopped." My mother looked at her hands. "And after that," I said, "it became easier not to. You never asked, you assumed. And after enough years of that," I paused, "I just stopped expecting you to be curious about me." My father sat down. He sat down heavily, like a man setting down something he'd been carrying for a long time, though I suspected he'd thought of himself as the one being let down all these years. The shift in that, watching him realize the weight had actually been on my side, was something I hadn't anticipated feeling. We sat there for a while. The room moved around us. Thomas arrived about 15 minutes later. He'd been at the back of the room for the speeches and had apparently heard the table announcement. He came over, looked at the placard, looked at me, and said, with this very quiet, dry expression, "So that's what you've been doing." "That's what I've been doing," I said. He nodded slowly. "I always thought there was something you weren't saying." There was. He pulled over a chair. It helped, his being there. It changed the shape of the conversation in a way that made it easier for my parents to ask questions rather than just absorb. And they did ask questions. My mother wanted to know about the clients. My father asked about the team. Who managed operations, how we handled contracts. He asked in the careful way of someone who understood project management and was trying to recalibrate everything he thought he knew. Every question he asked was a question he should have asked years earlier, and I think somewhere he understood that. At one point, my mother said, "We never asked you what you were working on." "Not once, did we?" "Not once," as I said. There was no cruelty in saying it. It was just the fact. She nodded. Her eyes were bright in the way eyes get when someone is holding themselves together. My father said, eventually, "I owe you an apology." What I said at dinner. He stopped. He was a man who had very rarely apologized for anything, and you could hear him working through the unfamiliar mechanics of it. It was wrong. And it wasn't the first time I'd been wrong about you. I appreciated that he said it. I want to be clear about that. An apology from my father was not a small thing. It was, genuinely, something I had not been certain I would ever hear. But I also knew that apologies don't reconstruct years. They mark a starting point. They say, "I understand now that I was wrong here." They don't automatically rebuild what eroded in the time before. So I said, "Thank you. That means something." And I left it there, not as a punishment. Because it was simply true, and I didn't need to perform either forgiveness or resentment for the room. Thomas walked out with me afterward, the two of us standing on Front Street while taxis moved past in the late November gray. "You good?" he said. "Yeah," I said. "I actually am. Do you think they'll be different now?" I thought about it honestly. "I think they'll try," I said. "That might be the most I can ask for." He nodded. "I'm sorry I didn't push harder. Over the years, I knew something wasn't adding up." "You didn't owe me that," I said. "But I appreciate it." We stood there for another minute in the cold the way Canadians do. Comfortable in the quiet, not needing to fill it. Then I said goodbye, walked to the parkade, and drove back to the office. I had a 4 o'clock call with the Vancouver PR firm and a campaign draft to review before end of day. The call went well. The campaign was good. The day continued, as days do. My mother texted that night. "I'm so proud of you. I'm sorry it took us this long to see it." I read it twice. Then I set my phone down and went back to the draft. She has texted every week since. My father called on a Sunday last month, asked if I wanted to grab lunch sometime. We went to a diner in Mississauga, sat across from each other, and talked for 2 hours, not about the company mostly, about other things, smaller things, the kind of things people talk about when they're trying to figure out how to know each other again. It is a beginning. I'm treating it as one, carefully, without too much expectation in either direction. But here is the thing I keep coming back to, the thing that felt more important than any of it. When I drove away from that dinner in October, the night my father told me, I had nothing to show for my life. I wasn't devastated. I was tired. Yes, I was sad in a specific way, but underneath that, something was steady. Something had already been decided long before that night that had nothing to do with my father's opinion of me. I had built a company. I had built a team. I had built a life in Toronto with good friends, meaningful work, an apartment I loved on the 22nd floor with a view of the lake that still made me stop sometimes. None of that had required my father's approval. None of it had waited for it. I think that's the part that gets missed when people tell stories like mine. The satisfaction isn't in the reveal. The reveal is just a moment. A Friday afternoon in a hotel ballroom, a table placard, a look on a face. It passes. The real thing, the thing that actually holds weight, is what you built in the years before anyone was watching. You don't need someone to finally see it for it to be real. It was already real. It had been real for a long time.